Namaste and in la catch, and welcome to this episode of One World in a New World. I'm your host, Zen Benefiel, and this week's guest is Joanna Bennett. She is a mother, a marketer, a writer, and an avid reader. She's a graduate of Rutgers with a with a BS in finance, so she's very practical with her numbers. She's a columnist and featured contributor for Biz Catalyst 360, and this is how we initially met, is through the Biz Catalyst Friendship Bench that meets every Thursday. And if you don't know about that, maybe you should stop by. It's a great group of people. She's also a partner of O'Brien Communications Group. And if you look back through some of the interviews, you'll see Mark O'Brien as being one of them. So you'll get a good flavor for both of them. Now, she's a mother of two wonderful little humans, and she's also an avid reader, an insatiable learner, and a self-acknowledged survivor. Joanna, glad to have you here. It's so wonderful to have some time.
Thank you so much for having me, Zen. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Good. So let's start. Let's step in the Wayback Machine and forget about Peabody and Sherman, right? And maybe that'll trigger some old memories for others. In your early childhood, were there some situations that you found that were kind of inexpressible, and yet you felt a deeper level of connection to the world around you than what was apparent to others as you were observing?
I think when you say that, the first thing that comes up to me is always my connection with animals as a child. I always had a very, very deep connection. My mom, thankfully, was one of those types of moms who let me have as many pets as I wanted. So we had rabbits and guinea pigs and birds and dogs and everything you could even imagine. And I was the kind of little girl that would go outside and pick out bugs and put them in Tupperware containers and name them, and they were my pets as well. I always used to catch grasshoppers, dig holes. I was very outdoorsy. I loved to, as I think of it now as an adult, I loved getting rooted in the earth. I loved being around just nature and the environment. And I didn't grow up in a town that was very nature oriented. It was more suburban city. I live 15 miles from Manhattan, so it was very close to New York City. So I just had my tiny little less than a quarter-acre backyard, which to me was a forest. I mean, I could do anything that I wanted to when I was in that backyard, dig holes as deep as my body and kind of do all that stuff. But one
great to have permission to do so too.
Yeah. I was always allowed to, as long as I was quiet and in the backyard, no one really bothered me. But I always loved the animals. Like, I remember one of my bunnies, his name was Houdini, and I have pictures of me growing up. I would dress him up in doll clothes and push him in little doll carriages. I had a baby carrier that I would carry this little bunny around with me, and that was just my roll dog. You know, he was with me all the time. He would come and do all different types of things with me. I had a very special connection with that rabbit.
Oh, that sounds awesome. I was fortunate too growing up, and I wasn't in suburbia. I was small town, 6,500, 7,000 people. And we lived on the outskirts of the town, and there was a woods about a third of a mile away that I was able to walk to. And I spent copious amounts of time in it by myself. And it was heaven, right? And few kids today, I think, take that opportunity and realize to first engage nature and then realize the benefit of doing so, because it really connects you to everything initially.
And I think being a mom and having two kids of my own, I think that that's something that parents either push or don't push. I don't think that's a generational thing. I don't think it's a kid thing. I think it's just the way that they're raised, because I have maybe just a little bit bigger of a backyard than I did then. But my kids in the summertime will spend the whole entire day outside. They will dig holes, find worms. I have chickens, I have dogs, we have a spider too, just because tarantulas are cool pets. But they will live outside. They will get muddy and dirty as soon as it starts raining. All they want to do is go outside and splash in puddles. So I do not think that I would say this generation of kids don't get it. I think that it's just their parents don't push them to do that.
I totally agree
with that. My kids also have PlayStation. They're young, but they still have PlayStation 4. They have Nintendo Switches. They have tablets. They have iPads, and they would much rather go get muddy and dirty and come in and take a nice warm bath than sit on their tablets.
Because they have permission to, and you're right. It's the parental willingness to allow the kids to be self-expressive in any way, and as long as they're safe, right? And parents usually will provide a safe environment for their kids. There are some instances where that doesn't happen. However, the majority have a safe environment in order to explore what happens. And what do you, let me ask you this, what do you see as the major challenge um, in giving your kids the opportunity to self-express, and you're around other parents as well? How do you see that that process or that ability in them, and the willingness to do so? And what do you think are some of the constraints?
See, I think for my kids, I think they're obviously lucky to have the environment to be able to do that. We have the backyard. We're not living in an apartment, and we're not living in some sort of environment that doesn't allow them
Sure.
to be out there and self-expressive. But I also think I'm pretty lucky, and I do apologize for that. My dog is crying at something. I guess the UPS man might be here.
Oh,
But I think that for them, they're lucky because I do a lot of reading. So I do read a lot about how it's best to let kids self-explore. I read a lot about validation and kids feeling seen and kids feeling heard, and kids feeling secure. So I kind of model my parenting out of a lot of the things that I read. And I don't think that that's a commonplace in today's parenting. I don't think that we like to take advice from other people or like to get different perspectives. We kind of pigeonhole ourselves, because before I started reading a lot of books about mothering and attachment theory and that kind of a thing, I did kind of say, this is the way I'm doing it. This is the way my instinct says this is the right way. No one else can tell me squat. But once you open up and realize that you don't have all the answers, that's when you find more answers. So I think that a lot of people just don't take that opportunity to do that. And it's so easy to entertain yourself with TV. It's so easy to entertain yourself with social activities that sitting down and reading doesn't seem to be the norm with a lot of parents, I would say, that I run into. And
mhm.
also too, I mean, work is hard. It's hard being a parent in 2023. I mean, COVID was hard. A lot of people didn't have the time and space. I mean, I'm super lucky. I work from home, so I don't have to commute back and forth to work. I don't have to worry about who's watching my kids when they get off the bus. So I do realize and recognize that I'm very grateful for having all the opportunities that I have to raise them the way that I do. And other people don't necessarily have that. I'm also a Girl Scout troop leader, which is pretty cool. So I get to run into a lot of the kids that my daughter goes to school with, and get to like learn about them and their personalities.
Mhm.
And we give them, the co-leader and we give them that space to be able to be self-expressive. Like we'll give them, like a bunch of 7-year-olds, here's a bowl of oranges, paint it. Some kids are very realistic and they paint the blue bowl and they put the 3 oranges. Other ones, they're doing like a space photo with oranges floating in space because that's what they felt like doing. And it's cool to be able to be the leader that says, yeah, do that, do the space oranges. That's
Okay.
cool. Who cares? Where a lot of people, I think, might say, oh no, we're supposed to be doing the realistic. So it's cool to be able to put my knowledge into other kids too, and show
Mhm.
them that they can have that space, that they're safe and they can explore what they want to, and be who they want to.
Do you think that our society, by and large, is more prescriptive in how to raise kids, and not being open to that further exploration of um, the self-knowledge and the parental knowledge that's available from others? Because we're not given, nobody's ever given a manual on how to raise kids. And yet there are such a variety and such a diversity of how we grow up as adults, that then have to learn how to interact with each other effectively,
Mhm.
which doesn't always happen, right? And, and yet, I taught high school back turn of the century, same kind of situation with parents, and the lack of parenting skills. And because of the stress, the survival, right, the security,
Mhm.
all the things that are important as a provider, that has to be done pretty much outside of the home, or at least did then. Now remote working has changed that, so that there hopefully will be a shift in how kids are being raised today, um, in a little, more positive way. And who knows what kind of changes that might produce 20, 30, 40 years from now, when those same children then have the opportunity to be more expressive and feel like that it's okay. There's little self-deprecation
Mhm.
from that perspective, because they're not being told, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. No, stay out of that. No, there's this encouragement and often embellishment of life as a result. Now, how do you see that being an important factor in how we're evolving as a society? Because you're also involved in some other things that would lend a different view and greater perspective as well.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think one of the things I learned as a mom, which I didn't have any idea of before, is I really dislike the generalizations that are put around parenting, because I do feel like it's much harder in 2023 than it ever was, I feel like, because we have car seats and we have safety precautions, we have laws, we have things that are put in place to make sure we do certain things appropriately. And I totally understand that. But when you think about the way I was raised, I was probably 7 years old when I was sitting in the back of my mother's station wagon, hobbling along because she was bringing home 12 kids from the elementary school, because she was the parent that was the stay-at-home mom and everybody else wasn't. And we'd all go to my house and she'd watch them until their parents picked them up. If I did that, I would go to jail. If I got pulled over and had 10 kids in the back seat of my car, I would go to jail. So I think that it is very different. And I think it's just something that as a society, and as you were mentioning a little bit before we were recording, it's a generational thing. So we're the first generation that's really been forced to kind of deal with these constraints. So you see a lot of parents that go into that narrow mindset because we're told that's what we have to do. Now, that doesn't mean I let my kids go in a car without a booster seat, because they have to be in their booster seat, because A, I don't want to get a ticket, and B, I know it is the safest thing for them, because there have been studies and there have been things that show that, and I'd rather get in a car accident and have my 2 children live than be a victim.
Err on the side of caution and safety. Why
Exactly.
not?
Exactly. But I also think that it causes these anxieties and these avoidances in certain parents, because they're nervous about how breakable and how damaged kids can be and kids can get. And when you overcompensate, I feel like we don't let them, like we were saying before, become individuals, and we don't let them kind of self-explore in a way. I mean, like I was saying, I let my kids outside, they play outside all by themselves for hours. I have plenty of windows, I can see what they're doing. Usually they're making mud pies into pizzas and delivering them in their little toy cars to each other, and it's hilarious. But there are also shovels that they play with. You could get hurt with a shovel. Thankfully, none of my kids have. I've also had, I mean, I have a boy and I have a girl, so just as a comment, I always thought that it was the way you raised them that made them different, but no, they are completely opposite. Raising a male and raising a female is 2 completely different situations. But I remember I had planted a raspberry bush, and it was just a very small raspberry bush. It was going to get bigger. I went outside, and that was one of his pizza toppings. He ripped it out of the ground and put it on the pizza topping, and every part of me is so mad, right? Because this kid just ripped up my plant that I just planted, and it's mine and it's beautiful. But also taking a minute to take a few deep breaths before completely losing my cool and saying he was trying to express himself. He had no idea that that was mom's raspberry bush. And the way that I react to him is going to change his experience in life going forward. I mean, not one instance. You're allowed to make one mistake as a parent, and it's not going to change your kid forever. But the more mistakes I can avoid and the more mistakes I can put to the side, and I think it's cool to look at the kids not as mistakes or bad kids or good kids. Like, it's all a matter of choices that they make.
Right. Well,
I mean, is he making a good choice? Is he making a bad choice? And I can kind of coach him along a little bit with that. Like, ripping out mommy's raspberry bush was a bad choice. We're not going to do that again. And then go inside and scream my head off when he's not there, because I don't want to ruin his sense of self and his spirit and his exploration and his joy. But my daughter would never have ripped out a raspberry bush from the ground and done anything with it.
Well, boys tend to be a little more mischievous and not thinking. They just do. I know I was that way growing up, and given permission to do so. And very rarely was I chastised. I was always, I had to clean up my messes, like, throwing mud pies on the back of the shed. I had to clean the back of the shed off when I was done. So those kinds of things, and again, fortunate, just as you were, to have and are to have the freedom to be expressive. And in that, do you feel that this the notion of having to control the environment is where we kind of get lost in thinking that, certain things has to be certain ways, and that freedom, um, and the ability that we have to nurture that, okay, this wasn't a mistake, nothing is good or bad, it's how we think it's so,
Yep.
right? And in this, just seeing your kid going, I'm just having fun trying to, play and enjoy myself. How can you fault a child for being that?
Okay.
You can't.
And
And
I will say that one time my son was being babysat by my neighbor, and she when I came back, she told me the story that he was making mud pies, and he was like, "Oh, Tracy, we're just gonna throw them against the back of the house." And she's like, "I don't know if that's a good idea, honey. Mom might not be so happy with that." And he was like, "No, it's fine. As long as I get the hose and clean it off, I'm allowed to do that." So it's just funny that you say that, because that's exactly what my son does. Even when babysat, no, I'm totally allowed to throw mud against the house as long as I clean it off. He's 5.
that's amazing. And he knows,
Yeah,
right? Because you've nurtured him into that. And
yeah,
there's no destructive. I don't think kids are destructive by nature at all. Excuse me. Yeah, nice to get caught up on that one, right? That they seem to be much more playful and interactive and sharing
yeah.
oftentimes, and unless they see other indications in the home that that's not the kind of behavior that they need to be engaged in, which is unfortunate. Now, how do you see this kind of, and I'm looking at future engagement, that these apocalyptic chats are all about how to get in touch with the inner nature that we have to be that, and then to find practicality in it in the world. So in this, how do you see this kind of um, freedom for expression being crucial in the evolution of our society today? And especially with the parameters and just coming out of COVID and remote working, changing things, and the whole societal shift, if you will, of first being afraid of each other and told we need to be, which I
Mhm.
believe is a false narrative.
Yeah,
And then coming out of that with people waking up and saying, wait a minute, we don't have to do that. We can move forward together and figure out ways of doing it better.
yeah.
How do you see that shift taking place? And when we're having conversations about this on the friendship bench, right?
Yeah.
Of how to get in touch with yourself, how to be that person that you truly are, not what has been imposed upon you for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think something on this topic that kind of drives me wild a little bit is the notion of social media. I think that our generation, this time, is the first time we've ever really had such access to other societies, other people, on a personal and a global level. So I think that the advent of social media and the advent of COVID really kind of pushed social media to be the way that we can be social. Zoom calls. I mean, like you said, the friendship bench, that's one example. We meet once a week with people from all over the world, and we have important conversations. Never has there ever been a time in the world as it exists that you and me and someone in England and someone in Italy and someone in Africa could be on a video call, see each other's eyes, feel each other's energy, have conversations about our feelings and the things that matter to us, and be heard and be seen and feel safe with that. And I think those little bubbles ripple bigger and bigger. There's also 10 million downsides to it. There's also lots of things that we have to work out and work through. But I do think that the good will ultimately outweigh the bad experiences. And I know one topic you're passionate about, cognitive bias, which is something that I too enjoy. And I think that that's something, like you mentioned earlier, I have a finance degree. So if I was living 2 generations ago and had a finance degree, I would have my knowledge base. That's what I would do. I would go to work and that would be it. I work for a communications company and I do marketing. How do I do that with a finance degree? Because I felt the universe pushed me in that way. I have a wonderful working relationship with my partner of 12 years. And we've built this together. We've built what we are, we've built our brand, and we enjoy what we do. But I also have the ability to read books and to learn from neuroscientists on the friendship bench about biases, about cognitive biases, things that I may never have been exposed to without the internet, without the age of social media, without the age of all this information.
Sure.
And that's something that drove me wild and makes me read and want to know more about psychology, psychiatry, mental health, all those kinds of things, which I might never have been, my interest might never have been piqued if I didn't have the access to that information. So I think that it's really important to have obviously our eyes wide open. There's good and there's bad about the internet. There's good and there's bad about everything that we can and will be exposed to. But I do think that we need to home in on the good, and we need to find ways to make that better and to find our interests, find what we are. I don't need to be defined by a degree that I decided to get when I was 18 years old. Joanna 20 years ago had no idea who Joanna was going to be today. Why should I be put in that box?
Sure. However, by getting that degree and understanding the mechanisms of finance, you understood or learned about process, right? And detail, and that all of those things have to line up in order for things to resolve at a zero balance, right?
Yeah.
And so, and it's not zero sum, it's much more than that.
Yep.
Because you're able to apply that kind of understanding and structure into another world and have it work better because of that prior knowledge. And now, one of the things that, and I agree, it's so wonderful to be able to meet with people from all over the world and have great conversations without the misunderstandings that often would take place because, for instance, like in the 80s, when American companies went overseas and tried to do business and set up facilities and things like that, 80% of them failed. Well, why? Well, there was no study of the culture that they were going into. So they expected the American way to supplant everything in that environment. And they didn't consider, well, how are people there? What do they need? How can we engage them to do what we need in a better fashion? And now we've got this construct that has evolved over 40 years to, oh, people are different. We need to understand the differences, not set them as a detriment, but to set them as a nuance that embellishes the relationship. Or imbues the relationships with greater understanding of other people. Because ultimately, do you feel that, and I say this quite a bit, but I'd love to get some corroboration from you if possible. Do you feel like our ultimate goal is simply to love and be loved?
Yes.
Okay.
Current book I'm reading, do you know who Dan Siegel is?
Yes.
So I'm a big Dan Siegel fan. He has a new book. I don't know if you've heard of it, Intra-Connected. It's came out in November, so it's relatively new. And like most Dan Siegel books, it takes me quite a while to get through it. So I've only gotten through the introduction. I'm taking a break and I'm going to go back to it when I'm ready. Sure. But the main premise of it is that we really are so connected to the world around us and the people around us. And we kind of, especially in the Western society, we live in this like solo self. Like when we were talking before and someone had asked you the question, like, where are you, Zen? What was your answer?
I'm in my body.
I'm in my body. So his idea of the solo self is that we tend to think of ourselves as this body. I am Joanna. This is my body. This is who I am. And I will experience the world as Joanna. But we don't tend to look at it the way that more indigenous tribes did, where yes, I am Joanna. This is my body. My parents gave me my name. I am white. I am heterosexual. There are so many labels that you can slap on me, but what makes me me is more than me. What makes me me is, for silly examples, I decided not to rake my leaves in the back this year because I read an article that bumblebees and crickets like to hide underneath them in the winter. And then you give them a moment to do their thing, and then they come out in the spring and you get to give the population a place to live. I read that article, I raked in the front, but I had to leave some in the back for them. That's what I'm looking at right now through my window.
At the potential of it.
But that one idea, that one article made a difference in the world. My relationships with my friends, with my family, my relationships that ended, my relationships that didn't, each one of those little tentacle of my life changed me and I changed it. So if we think of the world more as Joanna is not just this body, but Joanna is everything that vibrates around. Joanna is connected to the moon and the moon cycles. Joanna is connected to the spring. Joanna is connected to planting seeds in the spring and growing gardens in the summertime. There's so
And
much
being
that
on the
I am
moon is
connected
a really
to.
nice view.
Yeah. So we need to get out of the solo self and say, this is what I am, this is what I control, this is what I have power over. I need to kill the pests in the backyard and I need to do all this. And we need to just kind of realize that there's so much more out there. And I think globalization, like you were talking about in the 80s, that's when it started, that's when it began. But what can we do with it now? Now that we know, now that we travel places, now that we see, okay, maybe, I don't know, maybe when we were in the war with Vietnam, you would say Vietnam is terrible, they're doing bad things, everyone over there is awful. But when you actually look at the people that are there, they're not fighting against America. Most of them are fighting to save the life of the person that's standing next to them.
Mm-hmm.
They're not this big conglomerate of power and control that we like to think everyone around us is. We all just want to be connected to something. We all want to be safe. We all want to be secure. And sometimes our defense mechanisms come out and it's bad. And sometimes those defense mechanisms are from world leaders and they make really bad choices and they put other people's lives at risk. So I think that in my mind, we need to realize that we are just so much more. And we are just like you like to talk about energy and is it quanta and what we are and all of that. We need to just accept that. We are not Joanna who works behind her computer and does this and has kids and has to make dinner and has to do the laundry. There's so much more.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and I'm, as you've noticed, I play on the new pronoun phrase, right? And I am, we are. That's really what it is. I am, and there's no definition to that except what I choose to place on it for myself. And I don't know what all I am, and I'm curious to be.
Yeah.
And to become whatever it is that I am designed to be. And this is where that the notion of in this place of unconditional love, which we all want to achieve, right? And love one another. Well, what is the essence of that? Where does that come from? And when we pause, it seems that it comes from the nothingness.
Yeah.
Right? And we used to call it the void. Now it's the nothingness. And it's from where all things spring. Before we think anything, there's nothing.
Yeah.
And we don't actualize or integrate that pause button, if you will, to ask questions, shut up, listen, and let that answer come forth without our own prescriptive notions of it, which is what we tend to do. And especially with globalization, it's like, here's the prescriptive narrative that this is what we have to do, right?
Yeah.
And yet, what we find over time, and maybe you can corroborate this from your perspective, is it seems that that kind of activity was more about acquiring, kind of like the Ferengi, right? Acquisition, resources, and management of them for the benefit of a few rather than the majority. And now we're looking at, okay, wait a minute, we've got a huge population now, and there's a camp that says, oh, we got to cull it. And then there's a camp that says, no, we don't. We got plenty of space and land and technology to manage it all and be able to feed, clothe, and house everybody and provide them health care if we just figure out how to work together better in order to do so.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of the phase we're in right now, coming out of COVID and the sequestration and the abject, and this may not be true, but the phrase abject horror of being alone surfaced. We can't be alone. It diminishes our ability to be, because we're all sharing, we're all parts of, and I'll refer to the Vedantic philosophy, which comes from the Rig Veda and or the Vedas and Rig Vedas, thousands of years ago, 15,000 years approximately, that this has been around, Sanskrit originally, but it talks about the unity consciousness that we are all part of and as divine threads of, if you will, in these incarnations. And through my spiritual awakening I had at 18, I recognized that we're all cosmic consciousness, same concept, condensed into form, just unaware. Well, as we become aware, what do you find that you, in your own process of becoming aware of your own self, what else opened up to you? What other dimensions, what other worlds, what other considerations beyond this world opened up to you in that process? How did those
I
thoughts?
think for me, one of the biggest transformative idea is not the right word, practice, I would say, is meditation. I was really into a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And in it, he talks about Vipassana meditation and how important it is to shut your brain off for a certain part of time. So that way you can find the answers that you seek. So a lot of times, especially in our culture, and I know I felt this, we're go, go, go. Like, this is the to-do list. This is what has to get done, especially as a parent that has a full-time job. You have to constantly make sure there's groceries. You have to manage a household. You have to do all these kinds of things. But when you just take a break, and we don't realize how powerful it is until we do it. When you take a break and shut your mind off, you're able to go to different places and have different ideas. There's a guy, what's his name? David G, I think is his name. I don't hope I'm not mispronouncing it, but he has a couple meditations that I do in the morning, and he talks about like stardust. And I love the idea of, we are stardust, the clock is stardust, your computer is stardust, everything is stardust. And when you think about the universe as just elements of something so far out there that, like, I wish I could see a star. Obviously I could see them in the sky, but if I was to stand right in front of a star, I would go blind, I would die because it would be too hot. But imagine the power behind a star. And I am a star, like I am a part of a star, astrophysics, yes.
Right.
And just knowing that everything around us has been created by something that is so massive and out there. I think that going, again, that route that I just said, going to meditation and doing different meditations and meeting different meditation teachers, I was able to come across him and come across that notion. And I love just I usually meditate laying down in my bed because that's my go-to. Some people like to sit, some people like to lay on the floor. I prefer my bed. It's nice and cozy and comfy. And I just love thinking about how tiny, not in a energetic way, because I'm not tiny in an energetic way, but tiny in a physical way, that there's just so much else out there and so much bigger and so much to plug into. And you really you can make wishes and you can manifest things and you can attract things to you. And when you finally get that give and take and that push and pull, and you're just open. I mean, there was a time in my life where I thought I had to control everything, but now I'm just kind of open to what the universe thinks I need. Like, I don't need to have all the control and the power. What I need to do is listen. And I think meditation was my first little intro into being quiet, like you said, listening to something else, listening to someone else, listening and understanding who I am as a person in a different way. And then to kind of bring it full circle, having those ideas and those experiences helps me be a mom too, because I know that I can't teach my kids everything I know as a 38-year-old, but I can give them the ideas that they can decide those things for themselves. A small example of that, I was raised Roman Catholic, so I went through all of my sacraments and did all of that. And I stayed in the church for quite a while until I was about 18 years old. But when my children were born, their dad and I did not raise them in a religious household. He was also Roman Catholic. We just decided that like, we baptized one of our children just because his family kind of really wanted it. But that was just something we didn't really want to do. So they didn't grow up with that indoctrination like I did and like he did. But it was interesting. One day, my son, we were at the book barn, which is one of our favorite places to go, and he got a book about God. He wanted it because it had a cucumber on the front of it. I was like, all right, get what you want. And we read it, and he was like, what? He's like, God. And he never thought of this concept before, which is just wild. You got 5 years of your life without even having one Bible verse read to you. But he was like, so God's like everything, like God's my clock and God's my bed and God's the earth and God's the sky. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. You got way more of this than I ever did just by giving you the space to not be forced into it. And I just think that that's beautiful.
I do too. And do you feel that when we're able to release all of the outer attachments, that we acquiesce to that understanding that we're part of an integral part of everything, and that in that place, when we entertain concepts or dreams, desires, um, of that incorporate our being in the world, that those actually manifest over time. And oftentimes we don't realize, just, it's like we'll have thoughts years ago that, for instance, I had a 28-year dream come true that was just phenomenal. When I did my first version of this show, One World, back in 1990, I wanted to emulate Bill Moyers and Jeff Mishlev. Bill Moyers had the Power of Myth with Joseph Campbell, as well as other things, and Jeffrey Mishlev had Thinking Aloud on a PBS station across the country, and interviewed really weird people. Right, he had a doctorate in parapsychology, so he talked to people with or that had experience in multiple realms and books, PhDs, all those kinds. And I was fascinated by it. I loved his style, and I hoped someday to be worthy of an interview with one of them. 28 years later, through a situation totally, I'd set it up. I had a Ufology Press website, and Jeff had done an interview with a guy about the Greys, and he reached out to me through SnakePipe, which is a website feature for voicemail. And the only one that had been used, the only time it ever happened in the 7 years that the site had been up. And so I get the voicemail, and I'm listening to the voice, and I recognize Jeffrey's voice immediately. And my heart just starts racing.
Yeah.
It's like, here's the opportunity. And sure enough, I listened to the interview, I posted about it, I sent him the link, and I sent him a PDF copy of my big book, Stubbing My Toe on Purpose, subtitled A Seminal View of Consciousness, Cosmology, and the Congruence of Science and Spirituality, right? And just light reading, and 500 pages and plus. And he sends an email back 3 days later, hey, would you like to come talk about it? And that just, the feeling of connectedness, of acknowledgement by the universe, of finally stepping into a place of credibility that I hoped someday able to achieve. It was huge.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've felt, and maybe others have felt, and maybe not even recognized, when an accomplishment or an opportunity for an accomplishment occurs, that they actually thought about it many, months, maybe even years before, and it just took the universe that much time to set it up.
Yeah.
Because that's a lot of intricate details to get two people out of 7.5 billion.
Yeah.
That their data streams are,
Yeah.
crossed, and there's no
And I
explosion
think
that takes
that's
place
another
because of it.
powerful part of the internet that we don't give it credit for. I think that it's all energy, right? So
Yes.
whether you meet someone from the friendship bench, or you meet somebody on Facebook or a dating app or whatever, those interactions are not by chance, and the universe can have a larger power in different places.
And does. Well, when you consider it to be infinite intelligence, this is how we refer to it, right?
Yeah.
It's got all the answers. It is everything. Well, when we ask the right questions, and that come from the depths of our being, with the purity of attention, intention, and interaction as follow-up, then magic happens, or we think it's magic. However, there's a science behind that.
Absolutely. I'm going to be specifically vague in this one comment I'm going to make, but there's a nonprofit that I'm a part of, that I've been a part of for probably 4 years now, that there's probably 500 other people in this group. And I was going through a really rough time a couple months ago, where I was really kind of sad and going through some grieving process. And magically, like, the founder of this group reached out to 5 different people and was like, hey, do you guys want to be like the leadership team of this? I need help, and I've been doing it by myself for 2 decades, and I really need some help. Will you 5 do it? So 5 out of 500, just from me using my voice and speaking regularly to a whole bunch of people in this group that was on Facebook, I was able to become a leader in a group that is changing the way that the world works. And had I not been on Facebook, had I not used my voice the way that I did, had I not been as authoritative as I am, had I not done so many different things, that opportunity would never have opened itself up for me. But because of that, it did. And that's just something that in my mind was just so amazing. It was exactly the time that I needed it. It gave me something to kind of put my passion into. And I just, there are no accidents. That's something that Mark O'Brien, my partner, always says at work. There are simply no accidents. Everything happens for a reason.
Right. And
Good,
he
bad,
has
or
a
otherwise.
life of proof of it as well.
Yeah.
And that recognition, how do you find a place to be receptive and attentive to those moments where there's a greater connection that's taking place that benefits everyone? How do you acquiesce, or how do you process? How do you first, become aware of that uh, and integrate that
I
in,
feel like most of that in my life comes as like a hindsight. Like I feel like things happen and I just energetically kind of flow with them. And then a month or a week or a day afterwards, I'm like, oh, wow, that happened. That was supposed to happen. So I think when I'm in the moment, I tend to just be more present and aware of what's happening and trying to make the best decisions that I can in the moment. And then afterwards, I usually think back and say, how did I handle that? How did I accomplish all that? How did I do all that? And that's how I would say. Maybe I need to get better at that.
so in the reflection so in the reflection of asking yourself the questions,
Yeah.
okay, does that give you the better ability to strategize and plan an activity or an event in the future that has maybe not a specific result, but has a result that you don't know is exactly how it's going to happen, but you, in essence, project into the future with the attention, intention, and interaction of this, whatever it is, happening,
Mm-hmm.
and then find those breadcrumbs that lead you to it in the process of life, right? It's
Now,
like, who is it? Renee Wilkie,
okay.
right? That says, you got to live with the question. You
Yeah.
can't answer the questions with knowledge you know. You have to live with it and allow life to give you the answers. That's a really tough thing to do for most people.
And I think that I've never really thought about that, but having you ask that question is making me ponder. And I think it also goes back to meditation for me too, because I do a lot of manifesting meditations, and I do a lot of meditations that kind of do affirmations, ones that are like, I'm more than my body, I attract, I do. So like I do those practices, and maybe in those subconscious moments that I am not tallying what exactly I'm going to manifest. I don't write it down in a journal as I'm trying to zone out.
Well,
But
it's
maybe
energy,
in
so
those,
there's going to be a sense or a feeling
yeah,
of
so
that
maybe in those
accomplishment.
moments, that, because I have said a lot of times, like before the event I just told you about, like I'm searching for peace, I'm searching for resolution, I'm searching for all these kind of big words and big things, and then slowly these things come into my life that are going to ultimately give me peace, and they're ultimately going to give me the resolution, they're ultimately going to give me the confidence, and they're going to give me the power to do some things that I never thought I would do. And another, I just finished it, so it's probably going to be a year or two before it comes out, but I finally finished my first book.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. One of many, I'm sure. But it's currently, it's going to be edited within the next probably 2 months. And then we're going to see whether I do traditional or self-publishing. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other questions that have to come and go. But it's done. And that's something I never in a million years thought I would do, especially with a finance degree. I'm going to write a book.
Right. I always wanted to write a book, and was told, based on my experiences and the things that I shared in the 90s, everybody was like, you really need to write a book. Well, it took me 10 years. I started in 2001, I think, and it took me 10 years to write the book. And in the process, I wrote 3 others that didn't have anything to do with the book, because there were things that came up that I had to
Yeah.
express. And um, and it is a process, and um, there is a sense of um, catharsis
Yes.
in it, because especially when you're writing about the thing that you know about the most, which is you, right? Because we can only view things from our own experience and write
Mhm.
and experience and express from that place. It um, it gives this. Well, let me ask this: so how did that sense come to you during this process, and what are the kinds of things that you noticed were catharsis for you in the process?
So I wrote a memoir, so that answers that question. Writing specific events in my life that were scary and hard and difficult and grief stricken and all those kind of words that you could come up with.
Mhm.
Um, Going through each one of the events, it took me 3 years, so a little bit less, but still a lot of time in my mind. I thought I would sit down, write it in 2 months, and that would be it. But it does take a long time and a lot of commitment. Um, but writing it out gave me the ability to let it go. Writing it out gave me the ability to reduce a lot of the anger and avoidance and anxiety and all those kind of emotions around it, because I was able to get it out and let it go. And it didn't have to affect me anymore because it was no longer mine. It was going to be other people's as well. And it was going to help other people. So I think that type of catharsis, absolutely. And also just finishing it was cathartic in and of itself. Just being able to say, whether I sell one copy or I sell a million copies, whatever happens with this is what the universe wants to happen. I'm not going to
Mhm.
say I control it, because I absolutely do not. It's got to have its own life and its own
Sure.
energy and its own vibration. But whether I sell one or 100, if I help one person, if one person reads it and says, you know what, I identify with this and I need to make changes or things like that, I feel like my job is done. And
Sure.
then I got to do it again and again. So just knowing that I was able to put my mind to something that daunting and finish it and let it go, and
And
be
build the
proud of
layers
it.
of understanding, because as that catharsis takes place, you gradually step further and further and further away from it to be able to observe it without the emotional attachment to it, like you're saying, the letting go. And that is crucial in the development of self-awareness and your ability to manage the world in an effective way that makes it good for everybody,
Yeah,
right? Including you.
yeah,
And that wouldn't have happened had you not had that self-examination as you were writing,
yeah,
to be able to view that and think about how you were thinking about it.
yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting too, because I used a lot of journals that I had written at that time, text messages between me and a bunch of other people. So I was
Mhm.
actually living some of the exact memories in the exact moments. And it was so bizarre that there were moments that I completely forgot. Like it actually taught me a lot about our psychology and the way that our brains work, and like our cognitive ability to have memories, because a lot of things I thought I remembered correctly and I would write it out, and then I would go back and read some text messages or read my journal entry from that day. And I'm like, I totally forgot about that. And sometimes I would call my friends who were involved and I'd be like, hey, do you remember this? Because I have no recollection of this. I wrote this whole chapter of a book that I had to just delete because I was wrong. I was totally wrong in the
Yeah.
way that my memory absorbed it. And then my one friend, Jesslyn, she got on the phone with me one day and she was like, I absolutely remember it the way that it happened. And I cannot believe that you have this different memory. And then her and I having that conversation opened up both of our minds to the bigger picture too, because
Right.
it is so bizarre the way that our brains work, and we do love to think that we are always right and we always have the right answers and we always have the right memories, and how dare this happen and how dare that happen. But when you take a break and you just realize, like, I am totally fallible, like I am 100% able to make mistakes, I am not perfect by any means, my brain is not perfect, and that's okay, and I'm allowed to live this life with all of those truths. That's just
Absolutely. Now, do you feel that um, now that you have that awareness, does it seem like the memories are more developed from the emotions involved rather than the actual facts of the event? because it's like even with speakers today, a lot of them, doesn't matter what they say, it's how they make you feel
Yeah.
that you retain. And so do you find that that's something that, as you found out more about the event and did the recap with your friends, that there was that distinction of the emotion separate from the event and how it affected your memory?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you don't write a memoir about your lovely walk in the park and how beautiful it was. So it was a
Well,
lot of
that's part of it, because some of those do
a lot of
need to be
emotion
included,
tied into it.
right?
And I think that when you're in like that fight or flight mode, you don't record the memories as well as you would if you were taking the walk in the park, enjoying the sounds and enjoying the smells. You're worried about surviving. So when you're in that mode and your amygdala is amygdala-ing, I don't know if that's a word, but I'm gonna make it. You just don't absorb and you don't retain as much. And it just blows my mind that, like, on that topic, you if you go to court or if you go to testify or you go to the police or you do something like that, they expect us to record and to remember events so clearly. And you've seen, I'm sure, Law and Order shows where they put someone on the stand and they say this happened, and then they ask them another question and it changes a little, and like, oh, that person's lying, you can't trust anything that they say.
Right.
How about we have someone who actually knows how the brain works, because the brain actually doesn't record things the way a typewriter would, and then they can read it back. We really, as a society, and I think we're getting there. I think it's something like you mentioned, it takes generations to kind of get past certain things, but we do need to be more trauma informed and more aware of like how we actually work in order to create, like you were saying, places where we don't have aggression, where we don't have all this like anger that comes in and tries to force us into being things that we're not. I mean, if you have a victim up on the stand in a Law and Order show and they had some crazy experience and they're just trying to get justice, you should not badger them and you should not cross-examine them and try to make them slip up. Like, why is that the goal?
Right. Well, there's old prescriptive methods that aren't inclusive of that greater depth of understanding of our psyche and our ability to process, and the ways in which to facilitate that processing to have the best results of it, rather than this angry, the adversarial relationship.
Yeah.
Right, because you're there to get justice. Well, justice ought to be something that everybody agrees is true and needs to be. And in those kind of situations, there's this fight
Yeah.
that really doesn't seem to be advantageous. Now, but you do mention it in the short term, how we are shifting over the last few decades in the awareness and the consciousness, and even this was a big thing around the Mayan calendar and coming up to the solstice of 2012. There was this huge boon in awareness and consciousness, and there was evidence everywhere: TV shows, books, CDs, albums, music, all this kind of thing were moving us toward that. And yet we still have the inability to see on a long-term timeline how we've developed as a planetary civilization, which we really don't have yet. We have this globalization, but there's still separate entities that are interacting and attempting to control certain things according to what they think is best. Well, what's best for everybody? We haven't got to that place yet. And this is part of this transition coming out of COVID, in my opinion, is we're looking, okay, this affected us globally. How can we have a positive global environment that nurtures our humanity instead of sublimating it?
Yeah.
How would you see that taking place? What are some of the kind of things that, based on your experience and conversations with Biz Catalyst and the experience of a much larger personality base, if you will, how do you see that happening? Do you see that that it's something that's even on the table or being discussed, or is it something that hasn't quite gotten there yet?
I think it's such a really big topic to discuss. I think it's
I
something that
realize
we
that.
have
And
to do and experience. And I think with anything, I love the idea of pendulization. I think that that is just kind of how our society really goes. Like pendulum goes one way, and then we oh no, we went a little too far, and then we go the other way. We're like,
yeah,
we really just sit in the middle, like just floating around somewhere that's kind of
and hopefully the clock
equanimous.
never strikes midnight, right? Like,
Yeah.
or what do they call that? The oh, that clock that's at 3 minutes to midnight now.
Yeah.
I forget what the name of it is, but that just seems like it's pressure, right?
Yeah.
That we've got to do some things, and yet what is it that we need to do that would make the most profound effects in the shortest amount of times, and how could we proceed once that's understood?
I think it truthfully starts with understanding that we are connected to so many other people and to so many other things, and using that positively. So instead of saying, I am Joanna, how am I going to change the world? I need to say, I am Joanna, how can I talk to everybody else around me and all the things around me, and make a positive effort to show people the things that I do and I am capable of, and make my ripple bigger, and make my ripple more powerful. Like even being a mom, that's like such a powerful thing. So I get to raise two little people, and they're going to outlive me, God willing, and they're going to have their own footprint on the world. How I treat them and how I allow their personalities and self-talk, because that you learn your self-talk from your parents. How they talk to you is how you're going to talk to yourself.
Right.
And hopefully they can experience some of the things in life much earlier than I decided to learn them. I feel like I made this really big shift when I was 35, which is only 3 years ago. So that's just wild. But maybe they can just start the journey at a much more advanced pace than I was able to. And then imagine all the things that they can accomplish.
Sure.
Imagine what a self-aware 12-year-old is going to come up with, way more than a self-aware 38-year-old is going to come up with. So I think doing those things and realizing that we're not going to do it overnight. It's never going to change overnight. We're never going to say, hey, let's have this conversation, and all of a sudden the world is going to be in this lovely peace and harmony. It's
Right.
never going to happen. We just have to do our best. It's something, I know you know Byron Edgington from the Friendship Bench. One of my favorite things that he says is, I just want to leave the campground better than I found it. And that's what we have to do. If everybody did that, imagine what the world would be like. If we weren't out there to control situations, and if we weren't out there to be the biggest or the best or the baddest, and we were just out there to live our experience and in the most full capacity that we possibly could, and in doing that, helping the world be a little bit better than it was when we got here, bingo. What else could we do? I mean, I'm sure you were raised, I do believe you're a little bit older than me, but in a time where kids were
A
supposed to
little
be
bit.
seen and not
I've got
heard.
children your age.
Yeah, but seen and not heard. Like I was allowed to exist, but I better not talk a lot about it. I was, and I was a very
Pardon me, I have adults your
verbose,
age.
but I was a really verbose child. So that was terrible for me. I would get really, really good grades in school, but I would get terrible progress reports because if she talks in class,
I remember
she
that
doesn't
one.
shut up.
Yeah,
I
do
could
you
sit her next to
remember?
a wall and she
Yeah.
would keep talking. And I'm like, all right, well, I was a kid trying to like live her life. But to give kids the ability to do that and not reprimand, I mean, obviously in school you have to be a certain way so that you can accomplish what you need to accomplish. You can't be gabbing all through class. I get that. But I never had the environment to do that. I couldn't do that at home. I couldn't do that at school. Where was I going to do it? But having the experience and the ability to do that as kids, that's going to change everything.
Sure.
It's like kids are going to change the world, and we're raising them. I mean, my daughter goes to school and they teach her emotional regulation, and they teach her how to talk about feelings. When I was 7 years old, imagine what that generation is going to do.
We
They
never
are going to
had
kick
that. It was the old traditionalist, the Dewey view, right? Of here's the box, here's the things you need to learn in order to be productive, and go to work.
Yeah.
There was no real personal development. That was left up to the teachers that were able to handle that and all of that. I remember, I was just thinking, did you have a phrase that you remember from your childhood, maybe even your teenage years, that gave you a little more impetus, or was meant to give you more impetus to do or be more. My parents, the phrase that I always remember is, "That's great. We know you can do better." And what does that produce long term, right? Well, as you can, that you may not have looked, but if you look into my history or the things that I've produced, I'm an overachiever by, you know, an amazing amount.
Mhm.
And I've enjoyed it all, and it's made progress, and it's made me a better person. However, that initial, that's good, we know you can do better, that was kind of, not so much of an acknowledgement, right? Because there was always that, oh, but I'm not perfect,
Yeah.
right? And we want to be perfect. That's the ultimate. We want to love and be loved and be perfect in doing so.
I never wanted to be. I remember
Well, there's this idea
having,
of showing up to
yeah,
and doing our best,
yeah,
right? And
no,
in our
absolutely.
own minds, that's I want to be perfect, whatever that vision or
See, where I grew up, my sister was perfect, and I never wanted to strive to be what she was because I knew I could never reach it. So I never tried really. So I
ah,
never had that stipulation. But I do remember, like, when I went to Catholic school for the beginning of my life, I got like a D in penmanship. I got all, like I said, English, math, science, A's, 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 and then I'd always get something ridiculous. And I remember going home with the report card in my hand, and I would make the argument to, like, what I was going to say to my mom when she got mad at me in my argument. And I was in second grade, so my daughter's age. I went home, she saw it, she was like, "I can't believe you got a D in penmanship. What are we gonna do?" And my 7-year-old self said, "Well, Mom, my Uncle Joe is a doctor, and his handwriting is absolutely terrible. So I think I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up, considering I have all A's in my other subjects, but my penmanship is garbage." What is a mom going to say? She was like, "Oh, so you want to be a doctor? Okay. I can't really say much about that." And then that was the end of the argument. So I grew up knowing I was imperfect, and I was going to fight for my ability to be imperfect.
yeah, perfectly imperfect,
Yeah,
right? We make mistakes. That's how we grow.
yeah,
You know, I had similar. Um, I didn't have a problem with penmanship. My mother was an English teacher in junior high, and my dad was a tool and die maker. Um, both very astute and challenged my intelligence and gave me the opportunity to develop my own. Well, I was also very mischievous, and I listened to my friends that were encouraging me, and I was incorrigible. I poured some lathe in a wood shop, or poured some oil in a wood shop lathe, smoked up the entire room. And then this was my freshman year. And then in another situation, I was given a $5 bet that I couldn't hit our substitute teacher with a piece of gum from the back of the room. Well, guess what? It landed in between her glasses and her eyebrow. I could have never, and this was from the very back of the room. And of course, I had to divulge who did it. Well, that kept me out of, I didn't want to go for valedictorian, but I could have had salutatorian had I not done that. And you never know, right? I ended up taking a trip to California with the salutatorian for graduation, you know. So school was fun and enjoyable, and not without its challenges at the time. Growing up in a small town that wasn't diverse, we had no Black people. We had Mexican migrant farm workers during some of the tomato season.
yeah,
So I sought those children out
yeah,
to spend time with, rather than spending time with my classmates, because they were rather boring to me.
yeah.
And so I learned a lot from that. Plus, I was taking Spanish, so I was able to practice
Help me out.
Spanish too,
Yeah.
right? So these kinds of things, these opportunities, we don't necessarily consider when we're younger as to how they help mold and shape our ability to not just survive, but to succeed in the future through our own choice of what and how we want to be and do.
Yeah.
Now, what's your ultimate, what in your passion? I know you're working with Mark and clients and things like that, but looking forward, what's Joanna's real passion in life? What would you like to be when you grow up?
My
Or do you
10-year
care about
plan.
growing up at all?
No, my 10-year plan, I want to get into politics. I want to be a senator or a member of the House of Representatives, and I want to start passing bills and changing the way our society currently is. I think that that's the way to do it. And I think that I have the background, the intelligence, the ability to write, to be able to do that and to help people and change the world for the better. And that's what I want to do.
Excellent. And it also fits right into the live and let live movement, because our ultimate goal is to calibrate the law to remove aggression, which is some of the things that you're dealing with, how we aggress upon us, how we allow that aggression to take place, whether it's coercion, fraud, physical harm, property damage, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, those laws are there. However, when we really look at and create the path to change the laws, we might even be able to establish peace by outlawing war.
Yeah.
Now that's a long-term, and to some that may sound impossible, right? Us being able to talk, and as we were talking about BizCat and having the internet open and the Zoom calls, and 50 years ago, that was Dick Tracy stuff. Nobody believed it possible. It was all science fiction. Well, here we are doing it now. What can happen in the next generation?
Things that we can't even imagine.
Right. And especially Moore's law, right? With computers, that every 18 months it gets, smaller and smaller and smaller. I think we've even truncated that to where there's, things take less time, especially if there's a wave of I'll say linked consciousness in the thoughtmosphere, for lack of a better, right?
Yeah.
That infinite intelligence, because there's all kinds of different thought forms, if you will, of energy that we give our energy to. And as they grow, those ripples you were talking about build that energy, and then that energy is a resource base from which others can tap into simply by asking the right questions about it.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden that just opens the door to all this information that when you're patient and persevere, it shows up in front of you in some way, shape, or form, whether it's from another person, a book, a video, a show, an extraneous thought that all of a sudden just links up a bunch of points of order in your mind that you hadn't done yet.
Yeah.
Right? There's just all kinds of things that come out of that. Now that may seem kind of bizarre, and even talking about that kind of manifestation process. And yet when you step back and look at it from a scientific method standpoint of a consistent process that results in these things, it's not data points, it's experience. And they provide similar experience, maybe not the same information that results. That's different to each individual.
Yeah.
Right. And then those individuals coalesce into a greater whole because they're there with that piece that's necessary in order to provide that.
And the way you describe it, I think of it, that process, the scientific method that you described it, that's linear. So that's our linear experience. And we tend to focus on that a lot. But what about systemic? So if you just take that up the next level, and then you have all these linear processes from all these different people, places, things, now you're really going to see the ripple or.
Exactly. And as we become more aware of consciousness, there's the linear, there's the non-linear, there's the non-local.
Yeah.
Right. Because and there's, we used to think out-of-body experiences were just kind of happenstance and didn't really mean anything. And now we're finding that there's a lot of insight and understanding that comes with them when we're able to explore them without fear. Because a lot of times you pop out of body. The first time it happened to me as a 7-year-old, I thought I was going to die. Right? Because you're leaving it like that. So you have to address that fear of death.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I'd already developed the connection with the inner voice, and I heard this voice say, just relax, take a breath, let go. Everything will be fine. And by golly, it was. I did it. I popped out, and all of a sudden I'm on the ceiling looking at my body, and then I start thinking about that, and I pop right back in my body.
Yeah, disassociation.
Right. Well, I don't know if it's disassociation, just allowing yourself to explore other aspects of your own being. I
Well,
mean,
yeah, conscious disassociation, not disassociation necessarily from trauma, but the
oh
ability to
yeah,
be able to disassociate from
yeah,
yourself. Yeah.
I agree with that, and thank you for reframing that in a way that made sense for me.
Yeah.
Uh, and it did. And you know, when you've got the science now with all the different dimensions and planes of consciousness, and there's, you know, even those that have provide processes that integrate the bodies on those different planes of consciousness that we have. Now
Yeah.
that's a thought. Wow, be that huge. And you know, there's a theory of everything model, a quantum physics model that Nepi and Close posited in 2010, that consciousness, space, and time are tethered across 9 dimensions of 9 dimensions for the human experience, right? We're on the 3rd dimension, so there's 9 more that we have access to. It just so happened that I had a physical experience of that
Yeah.
in 1989. So 20 years, 21 years later, here's the science that comes along that says, oh yeah, that,
You're okay.
yeah,
Take a deep breath and you'll be fine, right?
right,
That's what the science told you. It's exactly what yourself told you too.
exactly.
Yeah.
And yet in the process, you know, I got to the end of it and was given the prompt to get ready to come back. And so I thought, okay, I'm ready. And I came back and I opened my eyes and I turned to the facilitator. And the first thing he says is, uh-oh. I'm like, what? What's wrong? I was ready to come back. And he says, no, you're supposed to drop the bodies off where you picked them up. And unbeknownst to me, I kind of flippantly said, okay, whatever. You know, I didn't realize, because I have a vivid imagination and I can visualize all kinds of stuff. I didn't realize that it was actually real. And that night, I was startled awake in the wee hours of the morning with a party in my room, not realizing what was going on. But there was all this noise and sound and voices and music and all kinds of stuff. And then a couple of weeks later, I had a friend that spent the night, and I gradually gotten used to it. And so it didn't startle me awake now. It was like, okay, this is happening again. I'm just going to kind of be with it, right? And just observe it. And um, this person was a practicing psychic. We were working on an event together, and she left her daytimer there and called from home 11:30 at night, say, hey, that's my life. Can I come back and get it? And I'm thinking, okay, maybe I can. It's a pretty healthy trip, so maybe I can talk her and spend the night and just see what she picks up without saying a word. You know, kind of the
Yeah.
blind study, if you will. And sure enough, the time came. I was sound asleep, or just barely awake at that point. And she sits straight up in bed. She goes, my God, how can you sleep in here? There's got to be at least a dozen different beings in this room. And I thought to myself, well, you dumb shit.
Vindicated.
Right, that's me. And I never thought about the capacity of that being true. And yet, based on that experience, and then 20 years later, having the validation of the science behind it, or at least a reasonable expression of it,
Yeah.
right? We've got that. What else can we do? And how can we align with those so that we do have that notion fulfilled? Like, what was it in the Nag Hammadi that Jesus said to Thomas, don't ye know that ye are God as I am God? You know, and Jesus said, all these things we do, ye can do and more. And he's not the only one that said that, by the way.
Yeah.
It's the one that's most paid attention to and brutalized in the way that Christianity has been proliferated around the world. You
Hmm.
know, it's been a bridge of church and state instead of a path to ascension.
Yeah. Yeah. I believe that.
Well, all we got to do is look around. The proof is pretty obvious if you look at it through that lens with that question.
Yeah. Power and control, aggression, how you put it. Same
And
animal.
not that it's been done to purposely harm. I don't think that was the original intention. It was for the purpose of management. And yet it's turned into, as with normal human ego conscious development, we go through phases, you
Yeah.
know, and planetarily speaking, we're probably just coming out of adolescence
Yeah.
and becoming aware of others. We're not so
What a time to be
self.
alive.
Yeah.
It's going to be exciting.
It really is. And so speaking of exciting, and we're kind of coming to a close here. It's not so exciting. It's like,
No.
it's good.
We'll have to do it again sometime.
Well, these conversations can go on and on and on. We're just highlighting the beginning of it and hoping that others will pick up on it and start having their own discussions with
Mhm.
others. You know, hey, I saw this wild and crazy guy on YouTube that's talking about this stuff, and he's got others involved. And gosh, some of it actually makes sense.
I got this one nugget.
So your nugget in parting, what might that be to the audience as to how they could, do something simple in their own lives to make it better for them and others?
I'm going to go with my meditation route. Download Insight Timer. It's a free app on anyone's phone, and just find ones that connect to you. Give yourself, start with 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, work yourself up. But give yourself the quiet and give yourself the space to have thoughts. We are very, very, very busy in the Western society, and we are very, very self-involved. And to just be able to give ourselves the space to take a break, take a breath, and feel what we are in our bodies is super important. And it changed my life without a doubt. So hopefully it could change others.
Well, if it changes one, it can change others.
Here we go.
That's the ripple effect.
Indeed.
Well, thank you so much for a brilliant conversation, and apocalyptic in some cases too. So we got to have that element in there.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Joanna.
Namaste.
And namaste and in la catch. And thank you for sticking with us for this episode of One World in a New World. I'm Zen Benefiel, your host, and I will see you next time.